Welcome to the Unity Forum, a cross-partisan program dedicated to fostering reasoned discourse and a more open society. In each episode, we talk with well-established experts to provide insight on recent events, elevate civil dialogue, and encourage greater mutual understanding on social, economic, and legal issues. Our host is Chris Malone, founder of Fidelum Group and author of the award-winning book, The Human Brand: How We Relate to People, Products, and Companies.
Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Malone, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. Thanks very much for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome our friend, colleague, and Unity Forum program partner, David Nevins. David is the co-founder and chairman of the Bridge Alliance Education Fund and the publisher of The Fulcrum, a daily news publication. The Fulcrum is a nonprofit, bipartisan digital news platform where insiders and outsiders to politics are informed, meet, talk, and act to repair our democracy and make it live and work in our everyday lives. Welcome, David. What can you tell us about our guest today?
Well, last week, and I imagine most of you watched it, the Fulcrum published just one day after President Trump addressed the nation and made several allegations about election fraud. I wrote a column in the Fulcrum urging our readers to pause, to reflect, and conduct their own deliberate inquiry before accepting or rejecting claims. Democracy depends on voters carefully analyzing the facts before jumping to conclusions. And it is precisely for this reason that I'm especially proud to present David Becker as our Unity Forum guest today. David is the executive director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research and co-author of The Big Truth: Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. I've known David for several years, and I can't think of anyone who better understands the intricacies of election administration, voting rights, election integrity, and the public trust that maintains our voting system. I'm confident that all of you will leave today's webinar better equipped to distinguish credible claims from misinformation and the all too common political partisan information presented. And hopefully you will better be able to safeguard the core principles of American elections that we are so proud of in our country. Thank you, and I welcome David Becker.
Thanks, David.
Welcome, David Becker. Great to have you as our guest today.
It's really good to be with you.
So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the Center for Election Innovation and Research and the work you've been leading there since you founded in 2016?
Yeah, I've been in elections for about 30 years now almost. I formerly served as an attorney in the DOJ's voting section for 7 years under 3 attorneys general, 2 Republican and 1 Democrat. Eventually found my way to the Pew Charitable Trust, where I worked there for 8 years and led the elections team there on work to improve election administration. And in 2016, in the summer, I founded the Center for Election Innovation and Research to continue a lot of that kind of nuts and bolts work in election officials across party lines to assist those election officials in the important work that they do. And little did I know, we were about to enter kind of a new phase where we were seeing a lot more threats to our democracy, kind of foundational understandings of whether we should trust elections, trust our fellow Americans who run elections, what are the checks and balances that we have to ensure that the people that legitimately won do take office. And so we've really continued to work with our core constituency, which are the public servants who run elections, the secretaries of state, the county election officials, local election officials, staff in all of those offices, even down to the volunteer poll workers that we see when we vote in person. They have been the targets of abuse, threats, and harassment for years now. They have been the targets of false conspiracy theories about their work that has made their work much more difficult. And in response to that, one of the things my organization also did is we founded something called the Election Official Legal Defense Network, which can be found at eoldn.org. And we have recruited thousands of lawyers from all over the country who are ready to serve pro bono at no charge to election officials who need advice or assistance from a lawyer for a variety of reasons. Their jobs have been threatened, their livelihoods have been threatened, their safety in some cases have been threatened. They've been pressured to do things that they know are illegal or improper. And oftentimes they just need a lawyer to talk to who can help get them through that. And we provide that to them at no charge.
Wow, that's really great. And let's dig a little bit further into that. What has that kind of pressure that they have been under, especially in recent years, meant for election administration? And are there things that we as the public can do to better support them?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, it used to be when I, first started CEIR back in 2016 and before that, most election officials would tell you that nobody understood what they did, who they are, or what, they thought they just showed up on, Tuesday of election day and put on an election. It was, I did some polling when I was at Pew asking people, who is the chief election official in your state? And I remember California's really clearly, over half the people said, I don't know, and it was multiple choice. 17% said the California State Board of Elections, which was interesting because there is no California State Board of Elections, and only 7% correctly said the California Secretary of State. That's turned on its head now. And now election officials are the targets of not just, they're no longer anonymous, but they are now the targets of unwanted scrutiny, false claims, doxing of them, doxing of their families, threats against them and their family members, sometimes sexualized or racist. This has become a regular occurrence. And yet, if you think about how well elections are run, they are still managing. They have fewer federal resources and state resources than they ever have. They are exhausted from the constant attacks and slander of their work. And yet, in the last four federal general elections we've had, 18, 20, 22, and 24, those have been four of the highest turnout elections we've ever had in American history. And they have been subjected to more scrutiny than any elections we've ever had in American history through litigation and social media and other claims. And every time those elections have withstood all of that scrutiny. It should be really comforting to Americans to think that despite these weird conspiracies that we have, that the Obama administration controlled the federal government in 2016 and President Trump won, that Trump controlled the federal government in 2020 and President Biden won. And then Biden controlled the federal government in 2024 and President Trump won again. That should alone demonstrate that no one is putting their thumb on the scale. There is no conspiracy that's going on, that our elections are safe and secure. And obviously, you and I will talk a little more about why, the specific details about our elections, why our elections, thanks again to those public servants who've been dealing with all of this harassment for so long, why, thanks to those public servants, our elections are more trustworthy today than ever before in American history.
Well, that's certainly encouraging because we've got midterms coming up in November, obviously. But in your mind, there's a lot of this in the news. But what in your mind are the biggest election integrity and voting rights issues that we as citizens should be watching closely?
Well, I think first of all, there's a lot of things that aren't issues. If I can take some license to talk about that, you'll hear the president say we should move to paper ballots. There was a big DHS paper ballots and audits. DHS on Thursday night released that as one of their documents during the speech that David mentioned. And those of us who work in elections looked at that and said, "Oh, great! You've now caught up to where the states already are 10 years later." We have paper ballots throughout the entire country, with the exception of Louisiana, which will move there in 2028. Every other state has paper ballots. Every state audits, meaning they take hand counts of those ballots. They review ballots by hand and they compare it to the machines. If the machines malfunction, if the machines were hacked, which is very difficult because they're not connected to the internet and they are under strict chain of custody. But even if that were to happen, we don't trust them. We audit them and confirm through the paper they counted them correctly. So we will hear, complaints about non-citizens on the voter lists, but non-citizens on the voter lists aren't an issue. New Jersey found a glitch. It was only 400 people non-citizens who had voted as a result of that glitch. That is 0.009% of the number of people who voted in 2024 in New Jersey. And that doesn't mean it shouldn't be fixed. It should absolutely be fixed, and they're fixing it. But it is also not altering elections. The Trump administration itself has determined that non-citizenship is not a problem, despite the rhetoric that they might use. They've reviewed 68 million records from states, compared it to their incomplete citizenship lists. They admit they don't have absolutely complete data on citizenship. And they have found that 99.96%, pretty good percentage, they could document were citizens. And of the remaining 0.04%, they just didn't have the information. And states have found that many, if not most of them, are citizens as well. So those are all, we're going to hear complaints about that, but those aren't issues. Mail voting is secure. That's not an issue either. We've been doing that since the Civil War. Republicans and Democrats have relied upon it. Trump won a majority of states that use significant mail ballots in the two elections that he won in 2016 and 2024. I think the biggest issue actually is that there is so much disinformation flooding the zone, much of it coming from the White House, that voters might be overwhelmed by this, and they might get the impression that our elections aren't convenient, are somehow difficult to participate in, that there's chaos surrounding our elections, that their vote doesn't matter because of allegations about rigging. And what our foreign adversaries learned long ago, and this is actually included in the documents that were released on Thursday that said the exact opposite of what the president said in his speech. Our adversaries realized long ago, trying to actually hack into an election and change the outcome is impossible in the United States, since thanks to our decentralized system and the safeguards that exist. But what is much easier is to get Americans to believe that our system has been hacked, or that it's difficult to participate in, or it doesn't matter. And they've been focused so much on disinformation, on influencing us to hack not into our machines, but into our heads. And that's what really concerns me. And David mentioned this a little bit about critically analyzing a lot of these claims, and he's so right. We all have to take it on ourselves to be skeptical of any claims, particularly claims that feed into our pre-existing biases or political preferences. I just received an email. I was on the media earlier and was talking about how secure our system was. And this was someone who thanked me, really appreciated what I said, and then brought up a left-wing conspiracy about how votes are being changed. And those people are raising money, and they're grifters just like the right-wing grifters are doing the same thing. Our system relies upon public servants of both parties all over the country. And if you go out and meet them, you'll be inspired by them. They don't do this for fame or fortune. And the way that everyone can help them, not only in voting and being an evangelist for our secure process, probably the best way you can help them, volunteer to be a poll worker. Go to your county election website, find out how to volunteer to be a poll worker. My teenage son has done it twice. It is incredibly rewarding. You'll find it very satisfying. It is not easy. You'll get trained. You will have a long day at the polling place. But that's because of all of the security procedures, all of the checks and balances and redundancies and transparencies that exist to ensure not that our elections are perfect. They rely upon a million people. There's going to be human error. There's going to be imperfections. But our system has been designed to be resilient against possible imperfections so that we get the right result at the end. And the best way you can learn that is be a poll worker. And then you also become an evangelist for our system. You can explain to others why our elections are not being stolen.
Wow. So you covered off about 3 of the questions I had planned there. So thank you for digging into all of that.
Sorry about that, Chris.
So that's all right. So let's talk about the courts and the role that they play in protecting and clarifying election rules. And are there risks if we've got major election disputes, that are being litigated close to election day? Is that something we need to worry about?
Yeah. So generally, the courts have been a stabilizing force. If you think back to 2020, every single court case went against the challengers. Every single court said, if you think this election wasn't valid, then bring in evidence. But we're not going to hear you. We're not going to look at your tweet to see if the election was stolen. You bring us evidence and we'll consider it. And every time, no one brought evidence. After conspiracy theorists had spread lies for years, they were held accountable in defamation cases, whether it be Fox News or Rudy Giuliani or Kerry Lake or Mike Lindell or others. And every single time in a defamation case, truth is an absolute defense. And yet none of them put on any evidence that what they had said was truthful. And in fact, Rudy Giuliani and Kerry Lake conceded liability and went right to damages, and Fox News settled for nearly $800 million out of court. So the courts have been really good about holding those who are spreading lies about our elections accountable. We're even seeing that now in some administration efforts to exceed their constitutional authority over elections. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution is the Elections Clause. And it says that state legislatures have the primary authority over elections in their states. That's very wise from our founders 250 years ago to see how important that was, what a security feature it was to decentralize our elections like that. And gave Congress also a role, but gave no role to the president or the executive branch. Incredibly wise. They were very worried that an authoritarian would come into office and seek to control the election process. And they thought of that in 250 years ago, which is just amazing. And courts are holding them to that. If you look at the two executive orders that the president signed seeking to dictate election policy to the states, those have both been blocked. Courts have said the president doesn't have this power. If he wants that power, he has to go to Congress and ask them to pass a bill. The Department of Justice has sued over 30 states seeking to seize sensitive voter data, driver's license numbers, social security number, dates of birth. I call this the holy trinity of identity theft. If anyone gets that information on any of us, they can destroy us financially. And for that reason, states have really important laws to protect that information. And not just blue states, but also several red states have said, we're not going to give that to you. You're not legally entitled to that. And of those 31 cases that have been brought, 16 have been decided by the courts already. And incredible to me as a former DOJ lawyer, the DOJ has somehow managed to go 0-16 in those 16 cases. I mean, that's blows your mind. No Department of Justice should be so incompetent as to bring that number of cases and lose every single one of them. And this isn't just Democratic judges who are ruling against the Trump DOJ. Of those 16 courts, 9 of those judges were Republican appointees, and 7 of them were Trump appointees, nearly half of those judges. So this is a bipartisan, courts are holding fast to that elections clause of the Constitution. I think that's a very good thing. I think we're going to see a little more coming up soon with regard to courts, as courts are considering whether or not changes can be implemented in time for the election. We're only 3.5 months away. It's too late for any major changes. Even if Congress passed a bill like the Save America Act, which it's not going to do, but even if it did, it could not be implemented at this point. It's just way, way too late. All of that said, courts are stabilizing. They're doing the right thing. They're applying the law in the right way generally. Courts should be the last resort, however. And especially anyone who doesn't like the rules around an election in their state or nationally, they should have already brought a lawsuit about that. What we've seen in past elections is sore losers and conspiracy theorists bringing lawsuits after an election that they've lost, as if they're waiting to see whether they're going to lose, and then they want to throw enough, chum into the water to see what's going to happen. Courts reject those, and they should reject those. If you have a problem with an election rule, bring it up early, bring it up well before the election. Don't put courts in the position where they're going to have to tell you, if you believe that's true, you waited too long. I mean, we're seeing that in so many of the administration's actions right now. They've been in office 18 months already. Why are we still talking about changes to the 2026 election? Why wasn't this brought up on day one? There's no way for election officials, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats, to implement any of the radical changes that are being proposed in some cases in Congress or by allies of the president right now.
Got it. Let's dig in specifically to vote by mail and early voting, which I know is one of those issues being litigated, one of those things that they're trying to change in some places. What can you tell us about the status of those legal challenges? What evidence, if any, we need to be thinking about relating to vote? Will the post office deliver those ballots, or is that a risk that wouldn't happen?
So first, let's take a little bit of a recent history lesson. Mail voting has been around in the United States since the Civil War. And over the last several decades, it has grown in popularity. And really, initially, that was pushed by a lot of Republican lawmakers, particularly in Western states, people who represented individuals who were living in more rural areas, who were perhaps older, who were property owners who might use mail more often, who move a lot less. Who do those voters sound like to Republican lawmakers? It sounds like they're voters. And so they started pushing easier, more accessible vote by mail, making mail the default, or in some cases, sending ballots to everybody. And that was pushed in states like Arizona and Montana and Idaho and Utah and other states, as well as blue states like California and Oregon and Washington. And up until 2020, no one thought anything of it. We all knew that the mail ballots were going to look a lot like the other ballots in a jurisdiction because both Republicans and Democrats like convenience. Some of them prefer to vote by mail, some of them prefer to vote in person. And then only in 2020, when the pandemic hit, and then the president started spreading lies about mail voting, did we start seeing a shift where Republicans kind of self-selected out of a convenient voting method for themselves and voted in person more, and Democrats almost overcorrected and said, well, if the president doesn't like mail voting, then it must be good. I'm going to do mail voting even if I don't necessarily need it. And that's an unfortunate shift because it's a secure method of voting, just like any other method of voting. Every single ballot is checked to make sure that the right voter returned it. Mail ballot fraud is one of the dumbest things anyone can do. You're going to be discovered and caught. We know that. It's one of the easiest forms of fraud to catch. And so if people choose to vote by mail, they should. There was a big challenge by the Republican National Committee to the 14 states, including Mississippi, that chose to allow ballots that were cast legally on or before Election Day to be delivered by the mail a few days later. That is what happens in about 14 states. The other states require them to be in by Election Day. Why do some states allow mail ballots to be voted that were voted on or before Election Day, not late, but on or before Election Day, to come in later? They might have a lot of really valid reasons. The mail might take longer in some states than other places. There's so many different reasons that could be the case. You could see a state like Alaska, which allows that, where mail can take a very long time, saying as long as we know you voted it, it was postmarked on or before Election Day, if the mail delivers it a few days later, we're going to count it. So that went up to the Supreme Court. There was a lot of speculation about how the Supreme Court would rule. The Supreme Court ruled at the end of their term in favor of the state of Mississippi and the other states by a 5-4 margin in an opinion written by Justice Barrett that said, no, there's nothing in federal law or the Constitution that prevents states from doing this, and so the states can absolutely do this. And that was the right decision. I think in many Supreme Courts that would have been a 9-0 decision. It was a little surprising it was 5-4, but fortunately that didn't upend an election just 4 months before a major election. I also want to talk about early in-person voting because you asked about that.
Of course.
I should say 37 states offer mail voting without an excuse, about 3/4 of the states. That's great. Likelihood is, if you're listening to this, you probably live in a state that offers mail voting without an excuse. Some might even mail it to you directly. It is a perfectly secure way of voting. Early in-person voting is offered in 47 states. The exceptions are Alabama, Mississippi, and New Hampshire. It is the way I personally choose to vote. You can choose the place where you vote, the time where you vote, and you also get what I really enjoy. I like seeing my neighbors who are volunteering to be in the polling place. I like voting with my community. I like taking my family with me when I go to vote. And there's another big advantage of early voting that is often not discussed, particularly in this age where we see losing candidates complain about ballots as they're being counted and whether or not margins are changing over time, which is of course how counting works. But those early in-person ballots in almost every state are among the first ones reported out. They're ready to go as soon as the polls close. They're going to report those out in almost every state. So if you want your vote to be among the first reported out, go and vote early in person. It is a great way to vote. I find it's got the best of the convenience of mail voting mixed with the community experience of Election Day voting. And as I said, it exists in 47 states. This is not partisan. Red states do it, blue states do it. It's a great way of voting. It's completely secure. And an additional advantage, if you're one of those people, like literally everyone in America is, who gets those annoying text messages and campaign messages and mailers and everything else, as soon as you vote, those campaigns take you off the list. So if you can go vote early in the early voting process, you're going to stop receiving that stuff. because they want to maximize their impact, and there's no point in trying to get you to vote anymore. So early in-person voting, just such a great way of voting, available in almost every state, as secure as any other method, including mail and election day.
That last bit was especially valuable, though. How to avoid all of that harassment
Yeah.
down the stretch. Now, you talked earlier about misinformation, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into that because artificial intelligence is becoming so pervasive and deepfakes and all of that stuff is becoming really sophisticated. What kinds of election-related misinformation are you most concerned about this year, and how can we evaluate? Any guidance on how we can evaluate those things we see online?
Yeah, I usually divide disinformation in the election space into two different buckets. One is disinformation that's campaign related, trying to make you like or dislike a candidate more based on a variety of things. Deep fakes about candidates, things like that. I don't work in that space. That's more political. But then there is the disinformation, and we've seen a lot of it, and a lot of it comes from foreign adversaries as well as domestic actors, that is designed to get us to misunderstand or distrust the process. The really kind of rudimentary sense of this is we used to see flyers in some neighborhoods that said, Democrats vote on Wednesday, Republicans vote on Tuesday. It's really crude and it didn't work all that well. But now in the age of the internet and social media and AI, that can get a lot more sophisticated. It could say, you could get an alert that a polling place was closed when it's not, that there's bad traffic on the way to a polling place when it's not. It can make you distrust the mail voting or the early voting process in various ways when you should trust it. And we see this constantly. It used to be that under the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, and the first Trump administration deserves a ton of credit for this, they built a tremendous amount of capacity to kind of fact check and correct a lot of this stuff and provide resources to election officials and voters who were looking for the truth. This administration, the second Trump administration, really declared war on the first Trump administration. And we saw that a little bit in the speech last week where, President Trump is speaking and I'm like, wow, he's really laying into whoever that guy was who was president in 2020. But the first Trump administration really worked to build up that capacity. And in the first couple months of this Trump administration, they dismantled all of it, just unilaterally disarmed in the disinformation and cybersecurity wars. And that's unfortunate, which puts a lot more on election officials who filled the gap themselves to make sure that correct information is out there, and on voters. It goes back to what David said at the beginning. Everyone should be a sophisticated, skeptical consumer of news. Only trust election officials for official election information. You can go to vote.gov, which still will direct you to your state and local websites. Go to your state secretary of state or lieutenant governor or board of election site. It differs by state, so that's why I'm being a little bit broad. But if you put in your state and elections, you'll probably find that in a search. Only trust those sites for anything related to, what are early voting times and hours? How do I get a mail ballot? When do I have to get the mail ballot in? How do I volunteer to be a poll worker? All of the core information about that, we're going to see more. Now, I don't know that AI is going to make this a lot worse.
Okay.
And that's not because I think AI is good necessarily, or because I think AI doesn't have this capacity to create problems. I think the reality is, though, our disinformation environment was already so bad before AI. There's not much more it can do. I mean, at this point, we're being inundated by messages that are just complete garbage, complete lies. But if they feed into our pre-existing biases, we consume them anyway. I have a great deal of sympathy for the millions of voters who voted for President Trump in 2020, who were sincerely disappointed in the outcome of the election. What American hasn't experienced an election and been sincerely disappointed? It's the most American thing ever. But then to find themselves the target of an ongoing grift for telling them that that election was stolen, not that the president lost it. Similarly, I mentioned the grift happening on the left. There's a whole range of grift that tells granted a smaller group of people, and it's not supported by leaders in the Democratic Party, that Kamala Harris actually won the 2024 election. Kamala Harris did not win the 2024 election. We know that. It is knowable, it is confirmed, it is verified. She doesn't think she won the 2024 election. She's never claimed that. And yet, There are people out there sending emails out, targeted emails, off sometimes using AI, just sometimes using other disinformation. And it always ends with, oh, and by the way, donate so we can keep this work alive because your candidate got that election stolen from them. So, I mean, there has been no stolen national election in American history. And I even add, I know people say, what about 2000? That was under the rule of law held sway then. People might not like the outcome. It was all done above board with two campaigns that were well represented by counsel. I don't use the word stolen with regard to that election. It is okay to disagree with the Supreme Court. That's fine. But we accept the rule of law in our democracy in the United States. And to his great credit, Al Gore accepted the rule of law in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's decision there. But I can tell you since then, certainly we know the outcomes of elections, and we know the person who won under the rules that we had took office.
Thank you. That's helpful. I know we could have a conversation about this all afternoon. Unfortunately, we don't have all afternoon. And so I do want to pause here and take some questions from listeners. First question is from Michael Lowenstein. He says, my biggest concern, what can courts or state officials do to prevent federal enforcement officers from showing up in polling places on election day to intimidate and dissuade voters? What are your thoughts on that one?
I'm so glad you asked this question. I want to be extremely clear. ICE troops, federal enforcers will not be at the polls. Hear me very clearly here. This will not happen. Let me give you several reasons why this won't happen. One, 18 USC 592 at SEC. It's clearly illegal, will be blocked by the courts as soon as it happens. People are ready for this. Two, DHS, ICE, federal troops don't have the capacity. We have hundreds of thousands of polling places all over the country. They just don't have the capacity to be in enough places. Three, we talked about mail and early voting. The majority of ballots in this country are cast by mail or early voting. The American voter has made themselves a moving target. That's really good. This is good for security, by the way. If anyone ever wanted to attack us, when do you attack us? Because voting is happening for days and weeks before the election. And the earlier you do it, the more likely we can mitigate it. And the later you do it, the more likely too many people have already voted. It's really, really hard to attack our system. It's one of our great security features. It's why when I hear the president or others say we should get rid of mail voting or early voting, they are literally trying to concentrate all those points of failure into a single 12-hour period on one day. It's not just foreign attacks, it's weather. It's traffic, it's power outages. It's insane to do that. So the fact that the American voter is a moving target makes this very difficult. And think about it. Thanks to the president's lies about elections, we now have a dynamic that didn't exist 10 years ago, where Republicans are disproportionately voting on election day, his supporters, and Democrats are very disproportionately voting early and by mail. And so if you were going to send troops out on election day, the likelihood is you might be dissuading your own voters as president of the United States. There's two more reasons. One, there would be a political backlash to this that I think they know. There's no way to predict what that would be, and it could be very harmful to the administration to do that. Lastly, you know how I know they're not going to order troops or ICE at the polls? Because they're trying so hard to make us believe that they're going to do it. Listen every time they get asked this question in a congressional hearing. Do they just definitively say no, like they know they should? Of course not. What they say is, we're going to follow the law and do whatever necessary to maintain election integrity or something like that, right? And then predictably, the president's opponents say, see, they won't say that there won't be ICE at the polls. I don't know why they're saying that, because ICE won't be at the polls. ICE won't be at the polls. Troops will not be at the polls. We should be telling every voter that. Voters default to not voting in a midterm. If you tell them it's going to be dangerous or unsafe, they are less likely to vote. That is what people who are embracing authoritarian policies want the American voter to believe. The people who are scared of the American voter want us to believe that it's going to be dangerous. It's going to be convenient and safe as it's been for every recent election, and we should be telling voters that. And on the off chance something happens with troops, I can tell you there are many groups, including mine, who are ready to go. That will be blocked immediately, and then the political backlash will occur. It's just not going to happen. And we should be very clear with all voters. Don't worry about this. Look at the primaries. They're running well, despite all of the disinformation. You're going to have a safe, convenient, satisfying experience if you join the other your neighbors and friends and go out to vote in November.
That's very encouraging. Thank you for that background. I have another question from Bradford that I don't completely understand, but maybe it'll make sense to you. David French with the New York Times is out with an op-ed piece today suggesting that the GOO majority could choose not to seat Democrats elected in 2026. But didn't the Supreme Court rule in Powell versus McCormick that the House can't do that?
So I'm familiar with the David French piece. I'm also familiar
Okay.
with kind of the scenarios around this is what happens if Democrats win a majority of the House, and there's some machinations in the House on January 3rd when the House gets seated to prevent the Democrats from forming a majority and electing a speaker. Um, this I first want to say it's not wrong to consider this. This is definitely a possibility.
Okay.
Um, the House on January 3rd doesn't exist. There is no House of Representatives
Mm-hmm.
until a quorum of members, which means 218 plus, is seated and takes the oath of office. I don't put it past outgoing former Speaker Johnson at that point, if this is what happens, trying to work with the clerk to prevent enough Democrats from forming a majority, even if they were duly elected. I don't put it past the President of the United States from seeking to interfere in the counting and certification process in the states to try to prevent certification. I think both those efforts will fail, but it will take a lot of work. And I will just tell you, again, I and many others are thinking and working about this to try to promote this smooth transition, whoever wins. We did this in 2024 as well. We anticipated that then candidate Trump was ready to undermine the Electoral College, perhaps even more so than he did in 2020 as president, if Vice President Harris defeated him. We were ready to go. Now, it became moot because President Trump won legitimately. And so we never saw that effort. If this happens, people are ready. It could be destabilizing. But remember, there needs to be 218 plus to even get the House to meet. And in this scenario, the Republicans won't have 218 under this scenario. Again, it's not a prediction. I don't know what's going to happen, but under this
Right.
scenario, if they have fewer than 218, all the Democrats could just stay away and prevent the House from convening until the clerk respects the will of the states and swears those individuals in. Now, that's not a great situation either. That means we don't have a functioning Congress. Now, some would argue we don't have a functioning Congress now, but we literally would not have a Congress because there would be no House in session. And the Senate would continue, but without the House, Congress can't act. And ask yourself who would fill that void. It would be the president, it would be the executive branch who would try to fill that void. So we should do everything we can to prevent this. It's not wrong to raise this as a possibility. There are a lot of structural safeguards that we would take advantage of to prevent it. But how crazy it is that we're having this conversation, that, nonprofits like mine, that opinion writers like David French have to propose this and prepare for the possibility that members of the House, of the previous House of Representatives, that the President of the United States might try to prevent the duly elected majority from being seated and taking power. Just the fact that we're even having this conversation shows that so many of the institutional guardrails have eroded.
No, it's no question. And for those who may be feeling kind of apprehensive and uncertain about how we're going to navigate all of this socially and politically, you have any closing thoughts of hope or inspiration or guidance? How we kind of navigate this on a day-to-day basis as we read the news and think about what's coming ahead?
I get it. I mean, there's not a day that goes by where we don't see attacks on our system of democracy. We don't see slander of our public servants who are running elections, threats of arrests of our public servants for doing their jobs so well. So I get why you're feeling despair if you are. I get why some are feeling fear. What I tell you is that's not accidental. That is an intentional tactic. There are those who embrace authoritarianism, who are fearful of the American voter, who want us to be despair, who want us to be overwhelmed, to want us to be fearful. We're in our 250th anniversary of this nation, though. We have sustained and excelled thanks to the American people, thanks to our public servants, thanks to our Constitution. And I refuse to forget that. And each election every 2 years is not some drudgery civic duty that we go and drag ourselves out to the polls. Every single election is a celebration of that 250 years this year. An election is joy. We should experience that. And for those authoritarians who are scared of the American voter, there is no greater response than joy. That will bug the hell out of them. Go recruit 50 other people who you're not sure are going to vote. And by the way, make 10 of them people that you probably don't agree with politically. Get them out to vote. Volunteer to be a poll worker. The highest turnout election we've had in midterm election we've had in modern American history is 50%. 1 out of every 2 eligible voters in the United States sat out the highest turnout midterm election we ever had. Imagine if we blow by that. Imagine if we just get to 55%, which is significantly lower than a presidential election. We could make the voice of the American voter, no matter what they decide, heard loud and clear, and do it with joy, embrace the celebration, get more people out to vote, and reject the division, reject the darkness and despair. That's what I'm going to do this fall. I'm really excited about the election, and I do predict we're going to see the highest midterm turnout in American history in November of 2026.
Well, thank you. That's certainly very encouraging. I plan to take your advice. I'll be working the polls for my 3rd time this November in the high school gym in our town. And just as you said, it's an opportunity to connect with neighbors I haven't seen in a long time. We catch up on our kids and all of that. And so it is a great experience. But David, I can't thank you so much for not only the history lesson, the factual education, the thought-provoking conversation that we have today. It's really been a pleasure. I'd like to thank our listeners as well for your time and thoughtful questions. We, of course, will be distributing a recording of today's program via email in the next day or so, and will also be released on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. So please feel free to share it. And be sure to join us for another episode of the Unity Forum. And we look forward, until then, to much more good news from friends like David Becker. Thanks very much, David.
Thanks. Great to be with you.
Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Unity Forum, please give it a rating, share it with others, and join us on Facebook at Alumni for Freedom and Democracy. And be sure to join us next time for another thought-provoking discussion on the big ideas shaping our collective future.